It's quite common these days to meet people who boast of being emotionally independent or being independent more generally, or are striving to become more emotionally independent. And on the face of it, this is an obviously sensible goal and achievement. After all, who would want to depend on somebody else? Doesn't that imply a degree of risk and the potential for an unenjoyable powerlessness in relation to somebody else? And the question I want to put to you in this video is whether actually it really is the most important thing to be emotionally independent. I'm not advocating codependency and a kind of extreme, unhealthy, dangerous attachment to people who might be toxic or abusive. I think obviously if we're going to have a degree of emotional dependence on others, it's quite important that we're selecting very carefully who we depend on and who we take that risk with, because it is always a risk. I would argue, though, that there's a tension between this drive to be emotionally independent and a need that is widely accepted to be wise and good to accept our emotional and relational needs. I wonder if the drive for emotional independence might often itself be a trauma response or an expression of views held about whichever sex one is thinking of depending on or has emotional and relational needs in relation to beliefs and worldviews that were formed in childhood that are then maintained through this pursuit of independence. So maybe as a child you concluded that men can't be relied on, or women can't be trusted, or whatever it is. And as an adult, your drive to be independent from whichever sex we're talking about stems from this childhood belief. Or maybe, perhaps more probably, as an adult, your dealings with whichever sex it is have made you conclude that it just isn't worth the pain, isn't worth the risk, because you depend on people, you get attached, and they let you down. But it seems to me terribly sad to reach such a conclusion and actually live by it. And also a position which will breed dishonesty with oneself. Be honest with yourself. Do you really want to spend the rest of your life never being held, never being cuddled, never being kissed, never feeling intimacy and deep connection with someone? I suspect if you're a typical person, you probably would say no. I actually would find that prospect quite terrifying. Actually, if I'm honest, I really enjoy those things. I have a preference for a life that features those things, for one without those things. A preference for intimacy, perhaps a need for intimacy. And people are really good, I think, at burying that need for intimacy. I've often, I suppose, dated and interacted with women who say, oh, I don't need intimacy, and I don't need affection, and I don't need sex. And then they even say, it's been years since I had sex, or I've been 4 years without sex and it didn't really bother me that much. But then when they actually have sex, if it's half decent and they have some, release of sexual energy, they feel a deep relief and a satisfaction that almost they didn't know they needed, perhaps. But then it's like, oh God, why did I wait for so long? And so people are good at switching off recognition of that need for intimacy, and isn't there a tension between this goal of wanting to be emotionally independent, but a goal that has been advocated by many approaches to psychotherapy of intimacy in transactional analysis? You know, it is seen as one of the measures. Oh, Jean, my cat. It's seen as one of the measures of, you know, success and progress in therapy, that people become more open to intimacy. And one of the reasons for this, I think, is that the obstacles to intimacy, the defense mechanisms that protect people from intimacy and the risks that it implies, were set up as a result of trauma. So it kind of makes sense that relational traumas and their healing, intimacy is going to be more possible afterwards. And I put it to you that trauma, relational trauma, the real hallmark of all relational traumas is that trust becomes more difficult. It becomes more difficult to put faith in other people. And yet intimacy requires trust, it requires vulnerability, and it requires a leap of faith in another person. And actually, it's cliche to say, if you get thrown off a horse, the only thing you can do is to get back on it. Otherwise, and we all know this is true, we set up these boundaries, these blocks, and these anxieties and fears become real obstacles. I think the same is true with intimacy. When we have relational dynamics that end up hurting us, we can choose to set up defenses and retreat and feel anxiety and fear about allowing people to be close, and anxiety and fear about giving our hearts to people fully and entirely, and being a fool in one's risk for love, which is what is demanded when love is true, that you are a fool in taking that risk. You can choose to set up defenses that prevent that from happening, or you can choose to get back on the horse, and you can choose to love someone again and to take that risk. And if you're not willing to take that risk, and you're not willing to actually love someone fully, you're not really going to get the intimacy that deep down you want anyway. Something I have observed in my years of dating is that many people just don't know how to love, and many people have never been loved. They don't know what it is. They don't know what romantic love is, and I think that's because so many people are so blocked and traumatized that love is becoming very, very difficult. And I feel like the internet is really making matters a lot worse, because what we have is an infinite database of traumatic experiences held both by men and women in relation to both their own sex and the opposite sex, which people can look up and bolster their justification for fearing intimacy and avoiding deep connection. As I said before, the real symptom of relational trauma, I think, is an inability to trust and put faith in people. And you only need to log on to Reddit to find infinite justifications for continuing to not trust and not have faith in whichever sex you're talking about. There are infinite, seemingly, accounts of women suffering trauma at the hands of men who betray their trust, and infinite accounts from men seemingly reporting trauma and accounts of experience where trust is broken and continuing to have faith becomes more difficult. And I think we have to be very wary of how we engage with this infinite database of trauma that we're building with the internet, because trauma has a way of contaging, I think. The more of those stories you read, the more and more difficult it becomes to trust whichever sex you're talking about, the more and more difficult intimacy becomes. And truly, I think especially the heterosexual dynamic is in terrible shape right now because of the combined weight of all of these traumas coming together and making trust between men and women very, very difficult. So you're on a date with a woman, she's trying to work out if you're going to be a rapist, you're trying to work out if she's going to try and trap you in some horrible sexless marriage and steal all your money and take your kids from you one day. It's not very romantic. And it doesn't allow for intimacy and connection to be built as long as people are going in with those trauma-informed mentalities. It's all very defensive and strategic after that point. And intimacy becomes very difficult, I think. Anyway, I've digressed as per usual, but I hope you found something of interest in my ramblings. Whether it's a need to become slightly less emotionally independent, or a need to perhaps approach people in a way less informed by fear and distrust, and more by faith and a willingness to take a risk. Because actually, if you want love in your life, you have to give love. And to do either, is going to involve a leap of faith and courage and bravery. And I hope that you will. I think it's terribly sad to give up on love. I will never give up on love. And I beg you not to give up on love. By following this advice, you will reap great pain and suffering, because often that trust will be disappointed. But love, intimacy are such beautiful experiences. None of us want a life without them. I think that the rewards outweigh the pain and the risks. So have faith and choose to love again.